The morning sun peeked through the blinds of courtroom 7, casting stripes of light across the polished wooden benches. Judge Raymond Blackwell adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, signaling for silence. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and a face that rarely smiled, he had become a fixture in the Lakeside courthouse. People said you could set your watch by him, same black robe, same stern expression, same punctual start at 9 a.m. sharp. "All rise," called the bailiff, though most in the room were already standing. The Henderson case was big news in their small city, and every seat was taken. Tom Henderson stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. At 45, he had built his hardware store from nothing into the largest in the county. 3 locations, 62 employees, and a reputation for fair deals. That reputation now hung by a thread. "The prosecution may begin," Judge Blackwell announced, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years on the bench. District Attorney Patricia Wilson rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the people will prove that Mr. Henderson knowingly filed false insurance claims following the fire at his warehouse, attempting to collect over $2 million for inventory that never existed." From the gallery, Henderson's wife clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Their teenage son stared straight ahead, jaw clenched against emotion. What no one in the courtroom could see was the tension behind Judge Blackwell's calm exterior. Last night's phone call still echoed in his mind. Mayor Phillips had been unusually direct. "Ray, you know your reappointment comes up next month. The business community is watching this one closely. Can't have people thinking Lakeside is soft on white-collar crime, can we?" Blackwell had said little in response, but the message was clear. As the first witness took the stand, a former employee of Henderson's claiming he'd been instructed to falsify inventory records, Blackwell noticed something odd. The man kept glancing toward the back of the courtroom, where Police Chief Rogers sat with his arms crossed. The witness's testimony seemed rehearsed, too perfect, without the natural hesitations of someone recalling events from memory. Defense attorney Lisa Chen picked up on it too. "Your Honor," she interrupted during cross-examination, "I'd like to submit these employee evaluation forms that directly contradict the witness's timeline." Blackwell felt a bead of sweat form at his temple. The documents appeared legitimate, yearly reviews showing the witness had been fired for theft 6 months before the dates he claimed to have witnessed Henderson's instructions. Objection. Wilson was on her feet. These documents weren't included in discovery. "Because they were only located yesterday," Chen replied. "Mr. Henderson's wife found them in their home office in a file that hadn't been seized during the investigation. Here was the moment of truth. By any fair standard, this evidence should be admitted." Henderson's face showed the first hint of hope since the trial began. Judge Blackwell thought of his 20 years building a reputation for fairness. He thought of his pension, his standing in the community. He thought of Mayor Phillips and his thinly veiled threat. "Objection sustained," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "The documents are excluded." The light seemed to go out in Henderson's eyes. From the gallery, his wife let out a small gasp. That night, Blackwell couldn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window of his study, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd lived for 30 years. Everyone respected Judge Blackwell, the tough but fair judge, the pillar of the community. But as he stared at his own reflection in the dark glass, he saw something different. A man making a deal with himself. Just this once, he thought. Just this one case. He couldn't have known that this one compromise would be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything he built, or that when the truth finally came to light, the consequences would be far greater than he ever imagined. The courthouse fell silent as Judge Blackwell entered on the final day of the trial. The bags under his eyes told of another sleepless night. He'd spent hours going through case notes, searching for something, anything, that would make his decision easier. But the evidence kept pointing in one direction, while the pressure pushed him in another. Tom Henderson sat straighter in his chair. 5 days of testimony had aged him. His once crisp suit now hung loosely on his frame. Behind him, his wife Donna gripped their son's hand so tightly the boy winced. "All rise," called the bailiff, his voice echoing in the packed room. The defense had presented 3 witnesses yesterday who testified about Henderson's honest business practices. His accountant brought tax records showing the inventory matched what had been claimed. A supplier confirmed deliveries of exactly what Henderson said had been destroyed in the fire. But Judge Blackwell had already made up his mind. Last night, another call had come, not from the mayor this time, but from Richard Powell, the biggest developer in Lakeside and a major campaign donor to everyone who mattered. "I trust you'll make the right decision, Ray," Powell had said. "We need to send a message about business ethics in this town." Now, as the attorneys delivered their closing arguments, Blackwell barely listened. Defense attorney Lisa Chen's passionate plea that the evidence simply didn't support a conviction fell on deaf ears. Her final words hung in the air. "Your Honor, this is a man's life, his reputation, his future at stake. The burden of proof has not been met." District Attorney Wilson countered with talk of deterrence and the need to protect the community from fraud, but even she seemed surprised by how thin her case had become over the course of the trial. "The court will take a 30-minute recess before rendering a verdict," Blackwell announced, rising from his seat. In his chambers, he loosened his tie and poured a glass of water with shaking hands. On his desk sat a photo of his swearing-in ceremony 15 years ago. He'd been so proud that day, so certain about the kind of judge he would be. A knock at the door made him jump. "Come in," he called, quickly composing himself. His clerk, Nancy, entered with some papers. "Just the updated calendar for next week, Your Honor." "Thank you," he said, not meeting her eyes. Nancy had worked with him for a decade. Would she look at him differently tomorrow? As the door closed behind her, Blackwell opened his desk drawer and stared at a small note card with the verdict he had written last night after Powell's call: guilty. When court resumed, the room held its breath. Henderson's son kept his eyes fixed on the American flag beside the judge's bench, as if it might somehow protect his father. In the case of State versus Henderson, on the charge of insurance fraud, this court finds the defendant. Judge Blackwell paused, his mouth suddenly dry. "Guilty as charged." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Henderson seemed to shrink in his seat. His wife collapsed against their son, who looked at the judge with eyes that asked, "How could you?" Chen was immediately on her feet. "Your Honor, we request sentencing be delayed pending our appeal. My client has deep ties to this community and is not a flight risk." But Blackwell wasn't finished. The court sentences the defendant to 7 years in state prison to begin immediately. The sentence was almost double what similar cases received. "This is outrageous." Chen protested over the rising murmurs. "Your Honor, this verdict ignores substantial evidence of—" "That's enough, Counselor," Blackwell cut her off, banging his gavel. "Bailiff, please take the defendant into custody." As Henderson was handcuffed, his wife broke down. "Tom, Tom," she cried, reaching for him as the bailiff led him away. Walking out of the courtroom, Judge Blackwell caught sight of Mayor Phillips and Richard Powell nodding with approval from the back row. The satisfaction in their eyes made his stomach turn. That night, alone in his study, he poured himself a double whiskey and tried to convince himself he'd done what was necessary. But as he raised the glass to his lips, his hand trembled so badly that amber liquid splashed onto the newspaper on his desk, right across the headline that would soon haunt him: "Local abuse and IESMNGETs hast SANTNC in CONTROVLSTLVLDICD." 3 months passed, and the Henderson case faded from the headlines. Tom Henderson sat in a prison cell 2 counties over, while Judge Blackwell continued his work at the courthouse as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. He found himself avoiding the local diner where he'd eaten breakfast for years. He took different routes home, making excuses to himself that he was avoiding traffic. Into this uneasy calm walked Maya Chen, a 29-year-old reporter with the Lakeside Chronicle. Fresh out of journalism school and eager to make her mark, she had pitched her editor a series on the local justice system. People trust courts to be fair, she had argued. But what happens when they're not? Her editor, an old-school newsman named Frank Taylor, had given her 3 weeks. "Make it good," he told her. "But don't expect to find much. Lakeside isn't exactly a hotbed of corruption." Maya started with court records, spending long hours in the basement archives. The Henderson case caught her attention immediately. The sentencing seemed harsh, and the trial transcripts raised questions. Key testimony from the defense had been struck from the record, and the judge had shut down several lines of questioning that seemed perfectly reasonable. On a rainy Tuesday, she knocked on the door of a small apartment above a flower shop downtown. The man who answered looked nothing like his employee photo from Henderson's Hardware. "Peter Walsh?" she asked. "I'm Maya Chen from the Chronicle." The former store manager glanced nervously down the stairwell before letting her in. His apartment was bare bones, just a couch, TV, and kitchen table covered with job applications. "I've been trying to find work for months," he said, gesturing to the papers. "Nobody wants to hire the guy who worked for that criminal Henderson." "That's actually why I'm here," Maya said, taking out her recorder. "Would you mind telling me what really happened at the warehouse before the fire?" Peever's hands twisted together. "What I said in court wasn't right," he finally admitted. "Chief Rogers came to see me before the trial. Said they knew about my DUI from college that never got reported. Said it would be a shame if that came to light now." "So you lied on the stand?" Maya asked. Peter nodded, shame washing over his face. "Mr. Henderson never told me to fake inventory records. Never. He was the most honest boss I've had." Over the next 2 weeks, Maya found more witnesses with similar stories. The insurance inspector who'd been pressured to change his report. The fire investigator whose findings about faulty wiring had been buried. She built a wall of notes in her tiny apartment, connecting people and events with red string like in the detective shows she watched. All paths seemed to lead back to Maya Phillips and a developer named Richard Powell. The same Powell who had mysteriously received approval to build on the land where Henderson had planned to open his 4th store. Maya requested an interview with Judge Blackwell through proper channels. To her surprise, he agreed. The judge's chambers were exactly as she'd imagined. Dark wood, law books, the smell of old leather. Blackwell himself seemed smaller in person, more tired than his official photos suggested. "I'm doing a piece on the Henderson case," she explained after introductions. "That matter is closed," he said firmly. "The jury heard the evidence and—" "There was no jury," Maya interrupted. "You decided the case yourself." A flash of irritation crossed his face. "I'm aware of how my own courtroom operates, Ms. Chen." She pressed on. "I've spoken with witnesses who say they were pressured to lie. I've seen documentation that contradicts the prosecution's timeline. And I found 3 phone records showing calls between your home and Maya Phillips the night before the verdict." The color drained from Blackwell's face. "This interview is over," he said, standing abruptly. "I suggest you be very careful about making accusations against a sitting judge." As he showed her out, Maya noticed his hand trembling on the doorknob. That evening, Judge Blackwell sat in his study, a half-empty glass beside him. His wife knocked gently before entering. "Ray, dinner's ready." He didn't look up. "I'm not hungry." "What's wrong?" she asked, concern in her voice. "You've been different since that reporter left." He finally met her eyes. "Carol, I did something terrible." Outside his window, a car parked across the street. Maya Chen sat inside, watching the judge's house as she spoke quietly into her phone. "Frank, I need more time on this story. It's bigger than we thought." Maya Chen's 6-part expose hit the front page of the Lakeside Chronicle on a Monday morning. Justice for SALE. "The truth behind DHE Henderson v. DHE," screamed the headline, alongside a photo of Judge Blackwell on the courthouse steps. By noon, the newspaper's website had crashed from too many visitors. By evening, 3 local TV stations had picked up the story, and a national news van was parked outside the courthouse. Judge Blackwell first heard about it from his clerk, Nancy, whose face was pale as she placed the newspaper on his desk. "You might want to see this, Your Honor," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. He stared at his own photo below the damning headline. The article detailed everything: the mayor's late-night calls, the developer's interest in Henderson's property, the witnesses who had been pressured to lie. Worst of all was a grainy security camera image showing Mayor Phillips entering the courthouse after hours the night before the verdict. Blackwell's phone began ringing. He ignored it, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Maya Chen had been thorough. She had talked to courthouse staff, other lawyers, even Henderson's teenage son, who described how his father had lost 20 pounds in prison and developed a persistent cough that the doctors couldn't explain. When Blackwell finally looked up, 3 more calls had come in. One from the chief judge of the district, one from his brother-in-law, and one from a number he didn't recognize. Judge Blackwell's office. Nancy answered the still ringing phone. Her professional tone quickly faltered. "Yes, I understand. No, he's not available for comment. I'll let him know." She hung up and turned to him. That was CNN. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the courthouse lawn. Someone had brought a hand-painted sign, "JUSTICNOTFOSAL." A woman with a megaphone was reading portions of Maya's article aloud to the growing audience. Blackwell's fellow judges avoided the elevator when they saw him waiting. Lawyers who usually stopped to chat suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. By lunchtime, the chief judge had summoned him to his office. "This is a disaster, Ray," Chief Judge Howard said, pacing behind his desk. "The Judicial Review Board is already calling. They're sending someone tomorrow." "The article is exaggerated," Blackwell tried, but his voice lacked conviction. Howard stopped pacing. "Is it? Because that security footage looks pretty damn real to me." He sighed heavily. "I've known you for 20 years, Ray. Tell me honestly, did you throw that case for Phillips and Powell?" The silence that followed was answer enough. That evening, Blackwell left through the courthouse's back entrance to avoid the protesters. As he hurried to his car, a familiar voice called his name. "Judge Blackwell, can I get your response to today's article?" Maya Chen stood a few feet away, recorder in hand, a young cameraman beside her. "No comment," he muttered, fumbling with his keys. "We have new information," she pressed. "An email from Richard Powell to Mayor Phillips discussing the Henderson problem and how you were going to take care of it. Care to explain that?" His keys slipped from his hand, clattering to the pavement. As he bent to retrieve them, someone shouted from across the parking lot. "That's him. That's the corrupt judge." A small group of people started moving toward them, phones raised to record the encounter. Blackwell recognized Henderson's wife among them, her face tight with anger. "Please," he said to Maya, suddenly desperate. "Not here." Something in his face must have reached her. She nodded slightly. "Tomorrow then. My office, 9 a.m. He escaped to his car as the crowd reached them, their questions and accusations following him as he drove away. Home was no sanctuary. 3 news vans were parked on his street. His wife Carol met him at the door, her eyes red from crying. "Ellen canceled our dinner plans," she said. Ellen had been her best friend for 30 years. She said she couldn't be seen with that judge's wife right now. The phone rang again. Their son David, calling from college in another state. "Dad? It's all over campus. My roommate showed me the article. Tell me it isn't true." The hurt in his son's voice broke something in Blackwell. He sank into his chair, phone clutched to his ear. "David, he began, then stopped. What could he possibly say? Later, alone in his study, Blackwell opened his laptop. The story had gone national. His face was on every news site. Comment sections overflowed with outrage, calls for his resignation, demands that Henderson be released immediately. He clicked on a video. Henderson's lawyer announcing an emergency appeal based on clear evidence of judicial misconduct. The camera panned to Henderson's family standing behind her, their faces showing a mix of hope and vindication. Blackwell closed the laptop and reached for the phone. It was time to call his own lawyer. The official letter from the Judicial Review Board arrived on heavy cream-colored paper with the state seal embossed at the top. Judge Blackwell stared at it for a long time before opening it, though he already knew what it would say. The investigation would begin next Monday. He was suspended with pay until further notice. He was to surrender his courthouse keys and access card. Carol found him in the study, the letter hanging loosely from his fingers. "Ray, what is it?" she asked, though the worry lines around her mouth suggested she already knew. "It's starting," he said simply. That night, Blackwell couldn't sleep. He paced the length of their bedroom while Carol watched from the bed, her eyes following his restless movement. "Come to bed," she urged. "Pacing won't change anything." But he couldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tom Henderson in handcuffs. He saw the mayor's smug nod from the back of the courtroom. He saw his own reflection in the bathroom mirror that morning, a man he hardly recognized anymore. "I keep thinking about what David asked," Blackwell said, his voice cracking. Their son hadn't called back after that first painful conversation. How do I tell my own son that yes, I knowingly sent an innocent man to prison because I was afraid of losing my position? Carol didn't answer. She'd been asking variations of the same question for days. The weekend passed in a haze of ignored phone calls and drawn curtains. Reporters still camped at the end of the driveway. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past their house. The Sunday paper ran a timeline of Blackwell's career, highlighting 3 other controversial verdicts that suddenly seemed suspicious in light of recent revelations. By Monday morning, he lost 5 pounds and hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Carol drove him to the law offices of Bennett and Winters, where his attorney waited. Paul Bennett had been 3 years behind Blackwell in law school, and the irony wasn't lost on either of them, the judge now needing legal defense from a former student. "It's bad, Ray," Bennett said once they were seated in his office. "The review board has more than Maya Chen's article to go on. They've subpoenaed phone records going back 5 years. They've interviewed courthouse staff. Nancy, your clerk, she told them about shredded documents." "I never shredded anything," Blackwell protested. "The mayor did," Bennett replied. "Right in your outer office, the day before the Henderson verdict, Nancy saw him." Blackwell closed his eyes. How had he not known? How many people had been involved in this corruption while he looked the other way? "What's going to happen?" Carol asked, her hand finding her husband's. Bennett sighed. "Best case. Ray resigns, the Bar Association issues a censure, and the appeal gets Henderson released immediately." He hesitated. "Worst case. Criminal charges for judicial misconduct, possible disbarment, and," he glanced at Carol, "significant financial penalties." The word prison hung unspoken in the air. That night, back home, Carol tried to coax Blackwell into eating something. He sat at their kitchen table, pushing pasta around his plate. "I spoke to Henderson's wife today," Carol said quietly. Blackwell's head snapped up. "You what?" "I called her. I thought someone should apologize to her, even if it wasn't you." "What did she say?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Carol twisted her napkin. "She said Tom has pneumonia. The prison infirmary isn't equipped for serious cases. They're trying to get him transferred to a hospital, but there's red tape." Her eyes filled with tears. "Ray, he could die in there. Because of what you did." It was the first time she'd said it so directly. The weight of it hit him like a physical blow. Later, he found himself in front of the liquor cabinet, reaching for the whiskey that had become his nightly companion. His hand froze on the bottle as something inside him finally broke. He'd spent weeks feeling sorry for himself, for his ruined career, his damaged reputation, his family's suffering. But what about Henderson's suffering? What about the man coughing in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit? Blackwell left the whiskey untouched and went to his desk. He pulled out a legal pad and began to write. Not excuses, not justifications, but the plain, unvarnished truth. Every detail of how the mayor and Powell had pressured him. Every moment of his own weakness. Every step that had led to this disaster. When Carol found him at dawn, he was still writing, page after page spread across the desk. His eyes were red but clearer than they'd been in weeks. "What are you doing?" she asked. "What I should have done from the beginning," he answered. "Telling the truth." The Judicial Review Board hearing was held in the same courthouse where Blackwell had presided for 15 years, but in a larger courtroom on the second floor. The irony wasn't lost on him as he walked past his own courtroom, now with another judge's name on the door. The room was packed. Journalists filled the back rows, notebooks ready. Maya Chen sat near the front, her tape recorder visible on her lap. To her right were Henderson's wife and son, both thinner than when the trial had begun. The son, Aaron, Blackwell remembered, stared at him with undisguised hatred. The 7 members of the review board filed in, all judges from other districts. At their center sat Judge Diane Porter, known throughout the state for her tough stance on ethical violations. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her expression giving nothing away. "This hearing will come to order," she announced, her voice filling the room without effort. "We are here to review the conduct of Judge Raymond Blackwell in the matter of State versus Henderson and other potentially compromised cases." Blackwell sat beside Paul Bennett, his attorney. Carol was 2 rows behind them, the only friendly face in the crowd. The board's attorney presented the evidence first: phone records showing late-night calls, bank statements with unexplained deposits, witness testimony about the mayor's influence. Then came statements from lawyers who had appeared before Blackwell, some defending him, others describing rulings that now seemed suspicious. Judge Porter turned to Bennett. "Does Judge Blackwell wish to make a statement in his defense?" Bennett started to stand, but Blackwell placed a hand on his arm. "I'll speak for myself," he said quietly. As he approached the podium, the whispers in the courtroom died down. This was what everyone had come to hear. "Members of the board," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I've prepared a statement, but I find I don't need it after all." He set aside the papers in his hand. "The evidence against me is substantial and, I must tell you, largely accurate." A murmur ran through the crowd. Bennett closed his eyes briefly, the lawyer in him recognizing a client going off script. 3 years ago," Blackwell continued, "Mayor Phillips approached me about a case involving a downtown property developer. He reminded me that my reappointment was coming up. I understood what he was asking without him having to say it directly. I ruled in favor of the developer despite clear evidence supporting the other side." The room had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath between keystrokes. 2 years later, it happened again with the zoning case, and then came the Henderson case. By then, it felt almost, he searched for the word, normal. The mayor would call. Richard Powell would make a campaign contribution to the judicial fund. I would find a legal reason to rule their way. Judge Porter leaned forward. "Are you admitting to accepting bribes, Judge Blackwell?" "No direct bribes, no. But favors, influence, the promise of continued position, yes." His voice cracked slightly. "I told myself it wasn't really corruption if no money changed hands. I was wrong." He turned slightly, looking directly at Henderson's family. "Tom Henderson is innocent. I knew it during the trial. The evidence was clear. But I sent him to prison anyway, with a sentence far beyond what was reasonable, because powerful people wanted him out of the way." Aaron Henderson stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger. His mother pulled him back down, whispering urgently in his ear. "I have no excuses," Blackwell continued, turning back to the board. "Only regrets, and a request that the board expedite its recommendation to the appeals court regarding Henderson's case. His health is failing in prison, and everyday matters." The remainder of the hearing passed in a blur. Other witnesses spoke, including courthouse employees who described seeing the mayor in Blackwell's chambers after hours. The final witness was Maya Chen, who detailed her investigation and the trail of evidence that had led to this moment. By late afternoon, Judge Porter called a recess for the board to deliberate. Blackwell sat alone in a small conference room, Bennett having stepped out to make calls. When the door opened, he expected his attorney. Instead, Aaron Henderson stood there, his mother a few steps behind him. "They're letting me see you for 5 minutes," the young man said, his voice tight. "Mom thought it was important." Donna Henderson's face showed the strain of the past months, deep lines around her eyes, a hollowness to her cheeks. "My husband might die because of what you did," she said simply. "The prison doctor said the pneumonia has reached both lungs." Blackwell felt physically ill. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words wholly inadequate. "Sorry doesn't help Tom breathe," Aaron snapped. "Sorry doesn't give us back the last 4 months." Donna placed a restraining hand on her son's shoulder. "We needed you to see us," she said to Blackwell. "To see what your decision did to real people, not case numbers. People." When the board reconvened an hour later, their decision was unanimous. Immediate removal from the bench. Referral to the state bar for disbarment proceedings. Recommendation to the district attorney to consider criminal charges. And an emergency communication to the appeals court regarding Henderson's case. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed out to file their stories. Blackwell sat motionless at the table, the full weight of the ruling settling over him. Finally, Carol came forward, her face drawn but resolute. "Let's go home, Ray," she said softly, helping him gather his papers. As they walked toward the exit, Maya Chen approached, recorder in hand. "Judge Blackwell, do you have any comment on the board's decision?" He paused, looking at the young reporter whose work had brought the truth to light. "Just that it's right," he said. and long overdue. 6 months passed. The leaves turned golden, then fell, and the first snow dusted the streets of Lakeside. Raymond Blackwell, no longer a judge, now just Ray, pulled his car into the visitors' parking lot of Westfield State Prison. He sat for a moment, gathering his courage, watching his breath fog the windshield in the December cold. The appeal had worked faster than anyone expected. Tom Henderson's conviction had been overturned within weeks of the review board's recommendation. But by then, his pneumonia had worsened to the point where doctors didn't want to risk moving him. So while legally cleared, he remained in the prison hospital, fighting for his life. Ray checked in at the visitor's desk, handing over his ID and submitting to the security screening. The guard's eyes widened slightly in recognition but said nothing. Everyone in the state knew who Raymond Blackwell was now, the corrupt judge whose fall from grace had spawned a wider investigation that had already taken down Mayor Phillips and led to Richard Powell facing multiple fraud charges. The visitor's room was half empty on this weekday morning. Ray sat at the assigned table, his hands folded tightly together. When the door on the far wall opened, he stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. Tom Henderson looked nothing like the confident businessman who had stood in Ray's courtroom. He was gaunt, his prison jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame. He moved slowly, carefully, like a much older man. An oxygen tube ran to his nostrils from a portable tank he wheeled beside him. Henderson stopped a few feet from the table, surprised to see who his visitor was. "They told me someone was here to see me. They didn't say it was you." "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me if you knew," Ray admitted. Henderson considered this, then nodded slightly and took a seat across from Ray. "Why are you here?" It was a simple question that Ray had rehearsed answering for weeks. Yet now, facing the man whose life he had nearly destroyed, words failed him. "I needed to see you," he finally said, "to tell you face to face how sorry I am. Though I know that's not enough." Henderson's laugh turned into a coughing fit. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket and held it to his mouth until the spasm passed. "Not enough, you think?" His voice was raspy, damaged by weeks of coughing. "I lost my stores, my reputation, nearly my life." He gestured to the oxygen tank. "The doctors say my lungs may never fully recover." Ray nodded, accepting every word like a physical blow. "I know. Nothing I can do will make that right." "Then why are you really here?" Henderson asked, his eyes shrewd despite his weakened state. "To ease your conscience." "No," Ray said firmly. "I'm here because my testimony next week will be crucial in the state's case against Phillips and Powell. I wanted you to hear directly from me that I'm going to tell everything, no matter what it means for me." Henderson studied him for a long moment. "They offered me a deal, you know. If I testify that I never heard directly from Phillips or Powell about their plans for my property, enough money to restart somewhere else." "Are you going to take it?" Ray asked, surprised. "What do you think?" Henderson's eyes flashed with something of his old fire. "Some things matter more than money, like the truth." They talked for another half hour, Ray explaining the wider investigation that his confession had triggered, Henderson sharing how his family had coped during his imprisonment. Not friends, they could never be that, but two men finding an unexpected moment of honesty in the wreckage their lives had become. As their time ended, Henderson stood with effort. "My doctor says I can go home next week. House arrest with medical monitoring until I'm stronger." "That's good news," Ray said, standing as well. Henderson nodded. "My son Aaron is getting married in the spring. For months, I thought I might not live to see it." He fixed Ray with a steady gaze. "I still haven't decided if I can forgive you. Maybe I never will." "I understand," Ray said quietly. "But I've started working with a lawyer friend on an organization to review questionable verdicts. We could use someone who knows the system from the inside." He held out his hand. "Think about it." Ray stared at the offered hand in disbelief before slowly reaching out to shake it. 3 weeks later, Ray stood in the back of a crowded university auditorium. Maya Chen was at the podium, accepting a state journalism award for her investigation. Behind her, on a large screen, was the logo of the newly formed Judicial Accountability Project, the organization Henderson had mentioned, now gaining national attention. "When I started looking into the Henderson case, I had no idea where it would lead," Maya was saying. "I just knew something wasn't right. One case led to another and another. In the front row sat Tom Henderson with his family, still using oxygen but looking stronger. Next to them was Lisa Chen, the defense attorney who had fought so hard during the original trial. We've identified 23 cases so far that show similar patterns of influence and corruption, Maya continued. Behind each one are real people whose lives were derailed by a system that failed them. After the ceremony, Ray waited until most people had left before approaching the small group gathered around Maya and Henderson. Conversations stopped as he came closer. "Mr. Blackwell," Maya acknowledged him with a professional nod. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to congratulate you," he said. "Your work deserves recognition." Henderson stepped forward. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Ray nodded. "I have. If you're still willing to have me, I believe I could help identify other compromised cases." "We start Monday," Henderson said, 9 a.m. sharp. As Ray left the building, he felt no sense of redemption or forgiveness. Those might never come. But for the first time in nearly a year, he felt something like purpose. The path ahead would be difficult, painful, and likely thankless, exactly as it should be. The truth had cost him everything he once valued, but it had given him the chance to become someone he might eventually respect. And that, he realized as he stepped into the cold winter evening, was more than he deserved.